Protesters waving the Taliban flag, chanting Allah Akbar and targeting Jewish students. Shows just how ugly these anti-Israel demonstrations are becoming at university campuses in Australia.
And it makes me feel not wanted. It makes me feel that I have done something wrong for being who I am. I have no family directly from the Holocaust, but I have many people that I know that are family friends, very close friends of mine, and grandparents who are still alive who went through those atrocities. And they're saying this is exactly the same, if not very similar to what we saw in the late 30s and early 1940s.
Jewish students are living in fear of what might happen next.
They have really become hubs, centres for extremism on our campuses. We've seen the footage from places like ANU and University of Queensland, where students have openly professed support for Hamas atrocities and have pledged unconditional support for Hamas. These things should not be happening in our civilised society, and certainly not on our university campuses.
But who are the people behind the protests and what's really motivating them? Sky News Digital Originals presents Protesters Exposed. Many students in Australia are right now having their precious time studying at university marred by demonstrators spewing hate.
It's been a pretty scary time. Walking around the campuses and you're just seeing all this stuff on social media, and a lot of your people that you've shared classes with, you've shared tables with, had conversations with, who you thought were very lovely people, and then obviously they're yelling these slogans, these anti-Jewish, anti-Israel slogans, making us really feel like, one, we're not welcome, and another thing to practice our faith, really.
Like many other Jewish students, Ben Lewis has been targeted and harassed by protesters at Sydney University's Gaza encampment because of his faith. Many activists surrounding the tents refuse to reveal why they're demonstrating.
So basically we started with a group of us, and we started at the front of it, and there was one or two people sitting down, just basically asking what's happening here. They said, they started talking, and then before we knew it, we look up, and these people were sprinting towards us, and sprinting, yelling at people, saying, don't speak to them, they're Zionists, they're Jewish, do not speak to them. And they just wouldn't even tell us why we're there. And then they continued saying, we're students and alumni, we'd like to have a conversation with you. And they go, there's a petition up there you can sign, but we're not going to talk to you. And we said, okay, well, what's the petition about? And they said they still won't talk to us. So how could you want to have conversations about whatever the message they're trying to send that we can't even find out if they won't even talk to us about why they're there in the first place?
These demonstrations are partly inspired by some of the horrific scenes that have unfolded at elite college campuses in America, where many students also couldn't articulate why they're taking part.
Now, the protesters, a lot of people are saying that they are protesting more than just about Palestine. I mean, there's been so much evidence that a lot of these young people don't even understand what they're protesting about. They don't know what river it is or what sea.
At Columbia, Yale and UCLA, masked demonstrators occupied schools with tent encampments and clashed with police while demanding universities divest from Israel. The mobs are often overpowering students taking part. Like we saw in the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, outside agitators are playing a central role in organising and escalating the protests on campus, and are often referred to by authorities as the usual suspects. Half of those arrested at the University of Texas and Columbia reportedly had no connection with the college. Protesters deploy classic block tactics by covering their faces, dressing in matching outfits, and attempting to swarm police.
I mean, a lot of these people aren't even university students. They're paid agitators. They're receiving money, foreign money, funneled in through various channels, and they're disrupting campus life. And most universities seem quite fine allowing it to continue. So I'm worried about that.
Who's bankrolling these protests? Well, some outlets claim US protesters are reportedly being backed by some of the biggest names in Democratic circles. Two of the organisers supporting the protests at Columbia University include Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. Both are supported by the Tides Foundation, which is seeded by billionaire George Soros. Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now were formed many years ago to call for equal rights and freedoms of Israelis and Palestinians. Sky News is not suggesting funders such as George Soros has any direct involvement in the protests and use of paid activists. Looking at some of the protesters, what's your understanding of some of the political agitators who have been attending?
You know, it's a great question. It's very hard to pin this down. In every country, it's been virtually impossible to find direct links. I suppose the closest is the French Ministry of the Interior that said they had identified Russian agents as actively participating in the graffiti riots and related things, the funding and the other activities of what was going on in France, but they didn't really prove it. But they've made quite a stink about how they're sure the Russians and what we're all calling today the Axis, that is Putin, Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, Yemen, that group intent on attacking Western values is behind that. We know that money is flowing from things like the Tides Foundation, which is backed by the Rockefellers, George Soros, some members of the Pritzker family, which owns Hyatt Hotels, among other things, some Jewish groups and some non-Jewish groups, and of course, things like Palestinians for America and, Palestinian groups. And funds are flowing into various organizations which are funding a lot of this. But the links are I don't think they'd hold up in court, but they're certainly sort of, common knowledge.
There have been paid agitators at campuses and rallies and sort of protests around the world for many years. But in this particular scenario, we're seeing organizations like Samidoun really organize and mobilize people around these encampments. They're encouraging people, they're paying individuals. And so you have money coming in from domestic sources. It's been reported that George Soros has been funneling some of this money through different channels. Qatar has been funneling money to Western organizations to enable them to carry out these activities. So it's very troubling, and the authorities need to find ways to crack down on this because Jewish students don't feel safe on campus.
As a former advisor to defence ministers, how concerned are you that these paid agitators are attending these college protests and that people who are attending them are being financially backed?
I mean, it's deeply concerning. Canada, the US, other countries are so squarely focused, laser focused on Beijing and Moscow that they have neglected to pay the appropriate attention to the Middle East. And now we're seeing that now. And on top of that, a lot of groups, several groups, I should say, appear to be politically off limits, whether that's the Arab community or the far left community. For whatever reason, politicians, university heads who are dependent on foreign funding, of course, they don't have it in them. They're spineless, and they would rather people feel unsafe, feel targeted, feel under threat than offend certain groups of people. So that's what we're dealing with right now across campuses throughout the West, and it sends a terrible signal to our adversaries throughout the world.
The New York Post reports the Columbia encampment was also organised by Students for Justice in Palestine, which reportedly receives funds from a web of Hamas-linked organisations, and Within Our Lifetime, which was central in organising the series of flood-themed protests in New York City, including blocking highways and causing riots at Grand Central Station. How exactly is money being spent at these demonstrations?
It pays for coaches to bring the people. It pays for food, maybe some booze. It pays for, the expenses to organize these things. And there has certainly been evidence in a number of countries that it actually pays for cash in the pockets of some people just to show up. And the police here call them the usual suspects. I mean, these are people who show up at any demonstration, a demonstration to save dingoes, they'll show up with if you pay them. It's the same people, and it's like professional football agitators who will show up to start hooliganism at a football match. So it goes straight to the grassroots, that money.
Let's look at who's funding the Palestinian cause here in Australia and through making large donations are possibly partly funding these hostile demonstrations. Sky News can reveal the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network has received tens of thousands of dollars from a non-for-profit trust last financial year. It's unclear whether those contributions have continued since the October 7 attack. But APAN has been actively involved in promoting anti-Israel rallies. In at least one protest, organisers called for Australia to boycott Israeli businesses. Not even university campuses have been free from this sort of activism. Some students and staff say they no longer feel safe to go to class. Can you talk to us more about the things that they're yelling at you and the things that you've actually seen at these protests?
Yeah, so a massive chant I've heard is there is only one solution, and that's Intifada Revolution, which are two major events, mainly in the late 80s to early 90s and the early 2000s, which were both really bad attacks on security forces. We're talking suicide bombings, shootings, stabbings, anything on security forces and civilians, both Jewish, Israeli, and even Arabs and Muslims and Christians. I mean, these things are not just light-headed slogans. These are seriously meaningful, hurtful attacks that are taking place on our campuses, in our Western democracy, in Australia, in Sydney, of all places.
It shows that things are getting progressively worse unless strong action is taken by universities. Having a situation where Jewish academics and staff can't actually go to their own campuses, can't lecture, can't teach, can't learn because of this band of extremists that are now taking over buildings, public spaces at our most prestigious higher education institutions. This shouldn't be allowed to happen. And there is a right to peaceful protest. There is a right to disseminate information, no matter how objectionable or extreme that information may be. But there is no right to occupy public spaces, to keep Jewish students and academics off campuses, to threaten, to intimidate, to harass, to publicly support war and terrorist organizations listed and prescribed in this country. That is utterly unacceptable. And if universities can't deal with this effectively, the police need to.
It's claimed many of the pro-Palestinian activists have no connection to the Middle East.
It's a wide mix, but a lot of it is a lot of white Australians, young white Australians, who clearly, and they've told me they have no connection to the Middle East, to Israel, to anywhere in the Middle East. It's just white Australians, but there are also some Muslim people. I mean, we saw just these chants continue and the infighting amongst the white Australians and the Muslim population at Sydney Uni a couple of weeks ago. And they're basically yelling at each other, one half telling the other half to get back because they're trying to yell more vile things towards people holding the Star of David's up, Jewish flags, and the Israeli flag.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear that there's a strong presence of outside agitators, that there is funding coming from various sources, because ultimately what these protests are about and what these individuals who support them want, it's not merely about a hatred of Israel. It's about a hatred for Western values. It's about a hatred for liberalism, a hatred for the US and Australia and everything that these countries stand for. And so no doubt those in a position of power and with means will see this as an opportunity to infiltrate these movements, to make them more aggressive, more violent, more extreme in order to pursue their ideology and their agenda. So we need to wake up to what's happening. This isn't a matter of students being concerned with human rights abuses or international law or the peace process or even a concern for the Palestinians. This is about being anti-Western, wanting to paralyze our system, our higher education facilities, our government, our way of life, and we need to stop this.
Demonstrators are calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, while around 100 hostages are still being held by Hamas terrorists.
It's becoming more and more apparent that what they're out there protesting for, a ceasefire, is impossible. How do you have a ceasefire with a terrorist group that says, you don't have the right to live and exist. And, what we did on October the 7th, we're going to do 10,000 more times the minute we get the chance. How can anyone have a ceasefire with them? I think a lot of people are thinking that more and more. In other words, if there were an actual workable solution, it would be different. But I just haven't heard one. All they're doing is yelling, for a ceasefire, and I don't see how they could have one.
Sky News recently revealed the University of Sydney is facing a potential class action lawsuit following the alleged incidents of anti-Semitism. University of Sydney Vice-Chancellor Mark Scott has apologised to students and staff who feel unsafe on campus, but has not ordered the encampment to disband. Mark Scott told 2GB Radio, debate, discussion, free speech and protests have always been part of university life, and vowed to call the police if criminal action takes place. We invited University of Sydney Vice-Chancellor Mark Scott to be interviewed for this documentary, but he declined. Many feel let down by his lack of action in stamping out hate.
We'll hopefully be okay, but it is a scary time. The universities do they say reach out to this person, but we all know that they're not really doing too much.
Is that disappointing?
100%. I mean, even from there's so many point of views that you could take, but what they're doing to the lawns, which is what they're doing to the lawns, they're ruining the lawns. There's litter everywhere. There's rubbish. It honestly looks like a slum in there, and and students are still having to pay for it, for that maintenance to take place. But then also from a social view, I mean, they say they care, but the vice chancellor will come out and be like, we've got no way of moving them on, and there is every way. It's private property. They could go in tomorrow, tear all those tents up, and just go, off you go. But they won't, and they don't.
We are. When you have people chanting in support of an intifada, which means the suicide bombing of Israeli civilians, when you have people chanting, and now a federal senator from the Labour Party repeating the slogan "from the river to the sea," which is an old Arab nationalist slogan calling for the destruction and ethnic cleansing of the state of Israel.
From the river to the sea!
When you have these sorts of things happening, it inflames tension, and you see it transmit to social media, where the tone and the tenor of discourse and commentary has become so nakedly and openly and unashamedly anti-Semitic. I'm seeing things online which I've never seen before, with the sort of regularity and the viciousness of the attacks on the Jewish community, the repetition of old anti-Semitic tropes and slogans. And this is all linked to a lack of leadership and what's happening in the public domain. It then flows into every aspect of our society. And if we don't stop it at the top, things will get worse and worse. And we're already seeing alleged terror plots against our community in Australia and around the world. And I fear what will happen if we don't step back from this chasm.
Geopolitical expert Roger Gewolb claims Australia is failing compared to other parts of the world where leaders aren't afraid to take a strong stance.
There is a noticeable difference from what I see between what's happening in Australia and in other countries, France, Germany, the US, and the UK. I think France and Germany have taken quite hard lines, and it basically really isn't happening very much, which is interesting because France, of course, they'll demonstrate over whether they'll riot if the coffee is cold one morning. But here, there haven't really been too many extreme things because the police and the government have clamped down. I think Australia is somewhere in the middle. I think ANU and other universities are kind of struggling, but they're being rather tougher than universities in the US and the UK, where I think their police and the local governments and authorities that control them have really been quite, I don't know if lax is the right word.
Semester 2 begins next month, and as students prepare to return to the classroom, many fear the anti-Semitism displayed at universities will only escalate as the Israel-Hamas war rages on.
I think no Jewish student is being complacent. I mean, you check your shoulder every 5-10 meters. You're just making sure. I mean, my friends hiding their chais, their Star of Davids. I mean, it shouldn't happen, but it is. So I think it's if anything, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets any better.